Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I get to share December clubs for Spellbinders. This is the new Glimmer of the month with some matte gold foil. It is an absolutely gorgeous floral. I can't wait to use it. Here is the clear stamp of the month as well as the coordinating dies to go with it. And I'll be using that in a couple cards. Then we have our 3D embossing folder of the month. There's some little tiny heart scallops on there. And then our stencil of the month. And I love, once again, that there are two different backgrounds that you can create with this stencil of the month. Here is the small die of the month with that gorgeous H and the florals to create that hello card. And then finally, the Monster Love pop die set. This one is the large die of the month. And I'll be using this for two different pop-ups as well as a card towards the end of the video. And then also share a sneak peek of my next video because I used it with some other dies to create a different pop-up. Now we're going to start out with the Glimmer of the month. So I have my Glimmer machine hot. I've cut a piece of the matte gold glimmer foil and I'm using some hammer mill cardstock. I'm also foiling the sentiments at the same time. And then like I do often, I have the solid hot foil plate to the side and I'll be doing my solid hot foiling as well. Look at how gorgeous that floral is. And I love the fact that this set also comes with the dies, not only for the two sentiments, but also to cut the side part of that foiled floral. So it creates a beautiful cut edge to go on your cards. Now I know that I'm not going to be using the solid floral for creating a focal point on a card, but I'm going to be using it on my card slightly behind my regularly foiled one so that I get a little bit of a gold foiled edge on it. I just figured it would be a good way to use it, and knowing that I wasn't going to be using it the other way, I figured that was a good compromise. So here is the solid hot foiled image. Now I had put my foil a little bit too high on my solid hot foil plate, so I can't use that second sentiment, but I can still use the Forever Yours one. Once I'm done, I line up the edge die to cut out that floral. And then I was going to do the die cutting in two separate batches, but I decided as I put it on my Platinum 6 machine that I might as well do the die cutting for the sentiments at the same time. There was enough space to place it on there. I do tape my dies in place with some Best Ever craft tape. Now, when it comes to this die cutting, you don't really have to worry about where you're putting the tape because it's only going on cardstock. But when it comes to die cutting the solid hot foiled piece, often those extra pieces, I like to use them to die cut little tiny pieces for my cards. Might as well use that foiled cardstock rather than have it go to waste. But just know that wherever you put that Best Ever craft tape, once it goes through your die cutting machine, it does remove some of that foil, so it does affect it. So you do want to be careful where you're putting that foil, you're putting that tape, sorry. Isn't that gorgeous, that floral gorgeous? I absolutely love it. Now I'm quickly cutting that solid piece and I'll tuck that to the side. This is the color palette I'm going for with the cards in the video today. I didn't want to do the typical pink and red with Valentines because a lot of these can be Valentine's theme. You don't necessarily have to have it, but I wanted to have some pinks and greens and I thought those colors were absolutely gorgeous. So I'm using some Hero Hues cardstock in Kiwi, Pesto, Azalea, and Plum, and I'm also using some Spellbinders Pink Sand cardstock. For these florals, I'm going to ink blend to color the florals themselves, and I'm using some detailed ink blending brushes just so that I can get a little bit more detailed with it. So I'm starting off with some Spun Sugar Distress ink. Then I'm going to go in with some Picked Raspberry Distress ink. And then I've brought in a Concord and 9th ink pad that I got recently. It's called Wild Berry. I've been looking for a while for a darker pink to use with Picked Raspberry Distress ink. And I bought a bunch of different pinks and swatched them on some cardstock. For this card, this is the one that I want to use with this one. And I really absolutely am loving how it blends. For ink blending the flowers, for my first layer with the spun sugar, I'm more interested in just getting an all over light pink on the base here. Then I'm going to go in next with that picked raspberry, and I'm going to use the edge of that detailed blending brush and just kind of flick the color out from the base of the petal behind other petals so that my petals look like they are darker towards the center and lighter towards the outside. Now, you could also use like a paintbrush that has a flat edge on here. I think that would be very easy to use as well. This detailed blending brush is round, so it's a little bit more challenging to get some clear edges on the edges of the petals. So you'll see that I'm moving my hand out so that my brush is angled kind of towards the outside of the petal, so I can just flick that color. I am going right in from the pad to the petals, but if you want to have a little bit more control and lighten the color, you could take some scrap paper, a dab off some of the excess color, and then do this and flick it. As with all ink blending and ink coloring, you can always add more ink, but you can't take it away. So I would suggest starting out by taking off the excess ink, and until you're comfortable with how much ink there is on the brush, then start adding a little bit more ink. Another option is to do this twice and to have one as kind of your tester or your scrap piece so that you can just make sure that you have as much or as little ink as you want covering it. Another option would be to use a really, really tiny eyeshadow applicator, and because it has kind of a foam tip to it, and use that to do your ink blending as well. That's an option as well. I've done that in the past. I haven't done it in a video, but I've done that in the past and that works as well. But I think this detailed ink blending brush works just fine for the look that I was going for. Now I'm going to go in with that Concord and Ninth Wildberry. I absolutely love this color. It's so beautiful and rich, and it works really, really well with the Picked Raspberry Distress ink. So I'm going in right where I have that Picked Raspberry and right towards the base of the petal. I'm just making it a little bit darker. Now, when you're looking at it now, you can see that you can distinctly see where the spun sugar is, where the Picked Raspberry is, and where that Wildberry is. Once I'm done doing all of the colors, I'm going to go back in once again with my spun sugar, and I'm going to go over the whole flower again, and that's just going to blend those colors just a little bit more. It is going to darken where I have that spun sugar, but I really like how it just blends all the colors in a little bit more and makes it more cohesive, makes it look a little bit nicer. However, there are flowers that have distinct differences between their lights and darks. They're not really perfectly blended, so you could definitely get away with this. I wanted it to look a little bit more toned down, if you will. So once I am done going in with that Wildberry, and you can see it goes fairly quickly doing this. It's obviously a lot quicker if you say have a layering stencil to go with a floral to do that ink blending. This one doesn't have a layering stencil with it, so this works perfectly. I am taking the time to take a dry cloth and wipe off my brush because I know I'm going to go back in with that same brush in the spun sugar, and I don't want to have any of that Wildberry ink on there. So I'm going back in, going over the entire flower, and I'm not being too careful this time where the end of the petal or where the end of one petal is and where the start of another is. I'm going over the entire thing and blending all those colors together. And you can see right away that first flower that I did is a lot more blended than, say, the bottom flower where I haven't done that yet. So I really like the result, and I think that going over the whole thing that last time with the lightest color really helps to blend and tie all those florals in together, and I absolutely love how they look. You could turn these florals whatever colors you want. This definitely doesn't have to be a Valentine's card. You could create a wedding card easily with this. I think it would be absolutely gorgeous. There's a little close-up before I start doing the greenery. So I'm going to do the greenery also with a detailed ink blending brush, and for the greeneries I'm using two different Hero Arts ink pads. I have Kiwi and I have Green Apple. These are part of the same set of ink cubes. I've been looking lately for some different ink colors to add to my palette, and while there's so many out there, I thought that some ink cubes would be a perfect way to add more colors to what I can create with, and they can also easily be used with the Better Press plates because they're smaller ink cubes. I figured that was a good way to start. I've been looking for some different colors, but also ink cubes that I could use with the Better Press, and this was the perfect solution. So just like I did with the flowers, I'm starting with the lightest color, and that's the Kiwi, and I'm just taking my detailed ink blending brush, and obviously this isn't the same brush I used with the pinks, it's a different brush. I started from the tip of the leaves and kind of flicked my way inward. Now I'm going in with the Green Apple, and I'm starting at the base of the leaves and kind of flicking my way up. So those two different colors can meet right in the center. So at this point, there's no white left on the leaves, but I am going to go in with the peeled paint distress ink and really darken the base of each one of those leaves. Now, this ink blending brush here is fairly small, but I am having to be fairly careful with the tinier leaves to make sure that I'm staying within those foiled lines. You could also use a smaller brush if you wanted to. This one worked, but I did have to be a little bit more careful. So now I'm going in with the peeled paint distress ink, just darkening each one of those, the base of the leaves, trying not to go up too much. I want to be able to see all three of those green colors. Once I'm done this, I am going to go back in with that Kiwi, which is the lightest of the greens, and blend all those colors together just like I did with the flowers. It really ties the whole thing in together, and I'm really impressed with how big of a difference going back in with the lighter color over all of it helps. Now, it was inspired by how I typically color with Copics. When I'm doing Copics, I'll do light, medium, dark, and then I go back in with the medium and the light. But when I had done the flowers for this, I just wanted them to be ink blended just a little bit more, or I wanted the colors to be going together just a little bit more. And by going over it with those light colors, it really it did exactly what I was wanting and hoping it to do. So now we're going to go back in with that Kiwi, and as you saw, I did clean off my brush to make sure that I didn't have any peeled paint ink left on there. If you don't clean off your brush, there's a good chance you're just going to be coloring your leaves with peeled paint, or at least the first several of them. So you do want to make sure to take the time to clean it off. I'm just using a microfiber cloth here. Paper towel would work. Really, it doesn't matter what type of cloth, but you do want to either use a completely different brush or take off the excess of that ink. Because the brush is small, it doesn't really take a whole lot, but you do want to take the time to do that. After doing that, I realized there was one leaf behind another that just kind of blended in together, and I wanted to give it its own color, its own shading behind there. So with that done, we're ready to start assembling the card. Now, one step I forgot here, or missed here, is the foiling will repel or resist the inks that we're using because they are dye-based inks. It's best once you're done coloring just to take a piece of paper towel and just blot on top of that foiling just to remove any of that ink. And here with that green, that's where I noticed that I had missed that step. So it's probably not going to take up much ink, but better to remove any ink that's left there than to accidentally get it on your fingers and smudge it, which is what I ended up doing. There's not really a fix for that because it's so close to the foiling. I think I would ruin the actual finish of the foiling if I'd gone in with a sand eraser. I just left it as is. It's one of those things that it probably isn't even noticeable other than to whoever makes the card and to whoever you point it out to. If it's in an area that really bothers you, that may be a good area to put your sentiment just to completely cover it. So I didn't know whether I wanted to use my foiled sentiment or my negative foiled sentiment, but I knew that if I wanted to use my negative foiled sentiment, I wanted it to be a darker color. So I chose that Concord and Ninth Wildberry ink to color it. So it's going to resist on the foil part, but it's going to color the white part of the cardstock. So my lettering is going to be that Wildberry color. I'm still going to see that gold foil. I put the flowers on a piece of pink cardstock here, and I'm going to do my mat with some Pesto cardstock. So this pink here is the pink sand from Spellbinders. I glued it down with that solid gold behind it, so I see just a tiny little border of that solid gold. I didn't want a whole lot. I just wanted just a touch, just to give it that finished edge. Then I trimmed it down once it was completely dry. And then after trimming it down with my scissors, the lines weren't as straight as I wanted them to be, especially on the long side. So I just went in with my trimmer and just removed any of those excess pieces, gluing all the layers together. And I still at this point hadn't decided which sentiment I wanted to use. In real life, I chose the solid hot foil piece because I liked it better with it. But on camera, on the video afterwards, I think that the white one is better. So it's one of those things that one minute you might have one opinion, another minute you have a different opinion. Neither one is right or wrong. It's completely personal preference. So with that card done, I'm going to start on working with the small die of the month. That's this gorgeous Blooming Hello die set. I have all my pieces die cut. I did that off screen and have them organized in my craft stacks here. And I'm just going to assemble the flowers. It's really easy to assemble the flowers, and a lot of these were die cut out of little scrap pieces. Well, that's one of the things I love about florals is they're really great for using up cardstock scraps. Now for these florals, I chose not to do any ink blending on them. I'm just using solid cardstock, but you could easily add ink blending if you wanted to have that visual dimension as well. The florals are super easy to put together, and you can see that they're coming together really, really quickly. I'm also going to accent them with a little bit of gold Nouveau drops, just for a little bit of more gold color as well as some texture. As with most of my cards, I'm using some Barely Art craft glue in a fine line bottle. This is perfect for assembling these tiny die cuts, but it also works really, really well for gluing my cards together. When you use liquid glue, it gives you a few seconds of wiggle room before that glue really starts to hold. So I love the fact that you do have that wiggle room, as well as the fact that it's a little bit more economical. It goes a lot farther because you really don't need a whole lot. And it takes maybe, 10-15 seconds for that glue to start grabbing and holding. So it doesn't take more time to be using liquid glue and waiting for it to dry. So for the tiny florals here, that's where I added those Nouveau drops. I'm just going to put them to the side. I did some Nouveau drops on some of them before filming, just so that those pieces were dry. I just did a few of them on camera, as well as the really, really tiny ones. When I was doing the other ones, I hadn't decided yet if I wanted to do them on the tiny ones, but at filming, I decided that I did. For my big H here, I have it die cut out of some pearl gold cardstock from the Gold Treasured cardstock pack, and I thought it would be nice to have some gold beneath it as well. So I'm using some brushed gold cardstock from that same Gold Treasured cardstock pack. I like the difference in finish between that pearl as well as that brushed gold. It gives you both the shiny as well as just kind of the pearlescent color. So I took my die cut H and then glued it onto that cardstock piece. Once that's dry, I will use my detail cutting scissors and fussy cut around it. It would have been really nice if there was already a solid H to go behind it, but it's an easy enough shape to do that die cutting. So while I'm waiting for that glue to dry, I've just taken my leaves for this piece, and I'm doing a little bit of ink blending on them with the green apple color as well as the peeled paint color. And I'm also going to use the stamps to do a sentiment on the inside of the card while I'm waiting for that glue to dry. So I have my clear stamp set here. Anytime I have a new clear stamp set, I use a white eraser on the stamping surface just to remove any manufacturing residue. I do the entire set, so I know that if I've used one stamp, I've done the entire set. I don't have to do this each and every time. It only needs to be done once. I pick my sentiment and use my Misty stamping tool to place that. I love using the grids on the clear part of the Misty to make sure that I have my sentiment straight. I will often have it a little bit crooked or a little bit curved. So being able to use those grids, it makes it really, really easy. I'm going to use that Concord & 9th Wild Berry ink to do my stamping. You can use any of the colors that we have used for inking, because any of them will work well with the colors on the front of the card. Once I have my H dried there, I'm using those detailed scissors to cut around it. Now I am angling my scissors so they angle underneath that cardstock. I want to make sure that I don't see any white edges from the cardstock that I am cutting. I'm also cutting it down a little bit. It's much easier to work with a smaller piece of cardstock than a larger one. And I'm going to do it little bits at a time. So I've done the bottom, I've done the side, and now I'm kind of curving in the side. Now I went for this particular side around each and every one of the leaves. After doing that, when I was doing the inside parts of them, I realized that I could just kind of lift up the leaves. The glue had dried, but it hadn't set enough that I couldn't still lift those leaves up. It did make it easier for that die cutting, and then I can just put them down once I was done. I didn't do any double layering for this, but you could easily do it. If you wanted that H to have a little bit more dimension, you could actually double or have two die cuts glued on top of each other for that dimension. I think that would look fantastic as well. I'm going to do a pink sand background with this, and I use the 3D embossing folder of the month. This one's called Tiny Heart Scallop, to add a little bit of texture behind it. So I'm not going to do any color with that embossed background, just that texture. There will be enough texture or enough color with the florals on the front of the H, and I figured some on the background would be a little bit distracting. Now I have the ELLO for the hello, and I'm just gluing them onto a piece of white cardstock. I figured this was the easiest way to make sure that they were going to be nice and straight, as well as the fact that I wanted them to have a background so that I could just glue down this entire piece as one. My intended plan was to put this hello in the center of the H, right along the bar in the center of the H, but when I ended up doing that while assembling my card, it just covered up too much and I didn't really like it. So I ended up putting it at the bottom just like it is on the die cutting package. I am going to be doing another video with this die set this month, doing it in a little bit of a different way. But at the time, this was the easiest solution for the final look that I wanted. It was going to be closest to the look that I was going for. You could also just take these letters individually and glue them onto the H. However, I would choose to die cut them out of a different color because they are die cut out of that same pearl gold. If you just glued them on as is, they would just kind of blend in and they wouldn't stand out. Now that white wasn't quite stark enough. I wanted it to have a little bit more of a matte around it, so I used some of the Hero Arts Azalea cardstock. I absolutely love this color. It's such a gorgeous bright pink, but not like fluorescent pink, more kind of a raspberry color. It's absolutely beautiful. So I'm just putting a really narrow mat around here. I don't want these pieces to be taking away from the gorgeous florals that are going to be on that H. Next, I'm putting my background of my card together. So I have some of that pearl gold cardstock for my mat here. That is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. The embossed pink piece here is cut down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So there's a 1/4 inch difference between my mat sizes. Next, I'm going to glue down that H, and this is still at the point where I thought I was going to put the rest of the letters for hello over top of the center of the H. So I will put that down, and then I'm going to put start laying the LO part on top of it, and that's where I realized that it just covers up too much. That H is so ornate and beautiful that by putting that on there, it really just covers that up, and it doesn't look right. So thankfully, this is another time where using liquid glue comes in handy because I can easily just lift that up. I put that LO part on the bottom, and then I can put some more glue on that H and then raise it just a little bit. I still put more glue on it because that glue had partially set, so it wouldn't have glued down quite as nice as I would have wanted it to. You also want to make sure when you're gluing onto embossed paper that you do use fairly generous amount of glue. You want to make sure that that glue reaches all the raised surfaces. You don't want to accidentally have glue where it's not actually going to stick. So for the florals, for this particular one, there's little kind of dots at the end of some of the stems showing you exactly where they intend for those florals to go. Now for some of the florals, I put them where they're intended to go. Some of them, I add them elsewhere. I add extra leaves to this as well, especially those large leaves. I just really liked the shape of them and thought they really filled out the area nicely. And then these flowers here that I'm gluing down right now, the sample only has one of these flowers, but I thought they were absolutely beautiful, so I added some extra ones. So just because the sample on the front of the package shows you one thing doesn't mean you have to do it that way. You can really get creative with it and have fun with it. That's part of the fun of this. And these florals can easily be used with other florals to create different looks, and without this H, you don't necessarily have to have this H to it. I think it's absolutely beautiful on there, and I actually kind of hope that Spellbinders comes out with other sets similar to this, but with different greetings. I think they would be absolutely gorgeous, especially if they have more florals with them. I have a thing for florals and foliage and creating with them. I do it fairly regularly, and I just love the dimension that it creates. For some of these smaller flowers here that have individual petals, I'm just using my fingers to curl those petals just to give them a little bit more dimension to them. And that's one of the things I love about these florals, is being able to give them that dimension. It makes them look a little bit more lifelike. Now, like I said before, I didn't do any ink blending on my florals, but you easily could, and it would definitely add a lot more detail and dimension to it. Because everything, there was enough colors as well as different colors to the florals and different shapes, I thought there was going to just be enough texture to it anyways that it wasn't absolutely necessary. Once I have all my florals down, I'm going to take those tiny green leaves and add them as well. And even though I said all my florals down, you can see that I don't have all of the light pink ones down quite yet. I typically will wait until I have some of the leaves down just to decide where some of those extra ones should go. I will often die cut extra pieces because I'd rather have more than I need than have to stop in the middle of a project and die cut more pieces and assemble more pieces. So better to have extras than not enough. Another thing that I will do is if when I'm done my project, I do still have extras, as I will take them and put them in a tiny Ziploc bag and just store them with that die set. So next time I'm working with it and I want to create with it, if I'm working with the same colors, I already have some pieces already done, ready to use. And sometimes they're great for just using up creating a bunch of cards. If you want to create some cards or create some things, but don't necessarily want to take the time to do any die cut assembling, having those extra pieces are sometimes a great way to start off because they're already done, ready to go. You can get some things done quickly and get your creative juices flowing. So when I'm putting together things like this, I typically will start with the largest of the flowers and kind of work my way to the smallest of the flowers. And then before I get to the tiniest, that's usually when I do the leaves and the greenery. And then the tiniest ones typically kind of go where there's some opening, some space left that just needs to be filled. But they're great space fillers, basically. So by going from the largest to the smallest, you can fill in an area fairly quickly and then discover where those small ones should go. If you go from smallest and then go with the bigger ones, sometimes you'll have those smaller flowers in areas where they'd be completely covered by the bigger ones. So just a little rule of thumb for something like this, smallest or biggest to smallest. If I'm just creating an arrangement, typically I will work from the center or start at the center and then work my way from the outside in. I will know where that center point is and then do some of the greenery for the back and then some of the farthest things out and work my way in. Usually the final thing is tucking some of the remaining flower or greenery behind that center flower. So it really depends on what you're creating as to which order you would go in. And this is a little bit different because there's the H there and it kind of shows you where the florals were intended to go. So the last step here, I'm done with my floral arrangement, but I thought it would be nice to have a little bit of sparkle in the center of that main flower. So I just added some stickles in the center. There's some little dots on the center part of that floral. So I put little stickles in there just for a little bit of extra sparkle. And I love all that florally goodness on that H. So now we're to the large die of the month. So this is the Monster Love Pop. And I'm going to create 2 of them. Now the one thing that I did when I was figuring out how to assemble this bottom part was I kind of created some mock stages so that I could follow that when I'm creating it. And I keep those with that die set. So anytime I want to create, I can remember what stages they go in. So to create this base, you're going to need 2 of the pieces that I have to my right that have the perforated lines in them. You're going to need 2 of the tabs that I have close to my right hand there. And then there's the tabs for gluing on the different die cuts on the top. And then there's the pieces that go around the outside, which I have die cut in green. They're right at the top of this screen. So the first thing I do before gluing anything is I take my pieces and I fold each one of those score lines back and forth. I want to make sure that they're folded both ways. They have good movement. It doesn't really matter whether they're only going to be folded one way for creating this. I want to make sure that they are all folded both ways before even starting. Once that is done, I can then fold the pieces for the outside piece here. Now these are only going to be folded one way. They don't need to be folded both ways. So I'm just folding them one way, kind of folding on my way in. I didn't do any ink blending on those green pieces, but you certainly could add it. So the first step is for this piece here that I'm holding, you're going to take that little indent where it goes in, you're going to fold it up and press that down. I'm doing this in real time and I'm going to do it twice because I am making that base twice. So you can stop and you can re-watch this if you need to do this again, but I am doing this in real time here. So after I have that little tab or that little flap folded down, I'm taking the little tabs that have one, or little strips that have one tab at the end, putting a little bit of glue on the side that doesn't have that tab. And when I'm gluing them down, I'm not putting a lot of glue. I don't want this glue to ooze out and spread out and possibly glue something that I don't want glued. I'm gluing this onto that tab, having the end of this strip right below the score mark above it. I'm also using my acrylic block here just to hold things flat while that glue is setting. And even though I'm using this liquid glue, it doesn't take long to set. Then I'm putting a little bit of glue in the tab at the end of that strip, folding up from the perforated line that's right below it, and gluing those pieces together. And then once again, putting that acrylic block on there to hold it flat. And you don't necessarily need to put an acrylic block on there. You could just hold it flat and wait. I just didn't want there to be a lot of time on this video where I was just holding things and waiting for glue to dry. So now we're at the point where we're ready to start gluing on those outer strips. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue on that bottom tab that we just flipped up. It's going to be glued to the bottom part of the outside strip. I have the tab to the left, or the final tab at the end of that strip to the left. It doesn't matter which side that tab is on, as long as they're exactly the same for both of these pieces. And you may have noticed for both of these pieces, we're doing exactly the same steps. They get built exactly the same way. So you don't have to build one differently than the other. They get built exactly the same way. Once that glue has had a few moments to sit, now we're going to flip this over, and there's a tab right here that we're going to glue to the other side or to the back side of that outer strip. So put a little bit of glue on there, flip that tab down. I like to press it, then put my acrylic block on, and then I'm ready to do the other side here. So we're going to flip that tab down, put a little bit of glue on it, press it down, and then again, let it sit, and I'll put that acrylic block on there. So once that has set, now we're ready to glue these two pieces together. So right below where my fingers are, there's two large rectangles. Those are going to be glued together. We only want to add glue to the bottom part of this rectangle. This is going to be the center inside part, and we want to make sure that we have some space to insert that tab to make sure we have an area to glue down our die cuts. So I'm only putting glue on the bottom of that rectangle, and then I'm going to match the edges, match the die cuts together. You can use clips if you want. I have some sewing clips that I sometimes use to glue things together. Those would be helpful here too if you didn't want to use an acrylic block and wanted to be able to hold things together, not necessarily with your fingers, but hold them together and let that dry while you're working on something else. That would work as well. With that bottom rectangle glued, we can push in the outside tab and glue that to the other piece. So now we're going to create kind of a continuous outer edge to go around the outside of the whole thing. And we're going to do the exact same thing with the other outer tab. Now you'll notice that when I put glue on each one of these tabs, I'm putting just a line right in that center. Again, making sure that we don't have too much extra glue. We want to make sure that it glues everything together, but not so much that it seeps out. And then with that all glued together, I'm just pressing it up and pressing it down till everything is nice and flat, making sure that we have lots of movement, making sure that everything is working properly. And then the last step for this base is to glue down the different tabs here. So there's two that are shorter, one that is longer. The longer one goes in the center of that platform. And there's just some small tabs at the bottom of it. That's just where I'm putting the glue. I'm only putting the glue on the one side. You could put it on both sides if you want, but really only one side is necessary. And I'm putting that tab in so the bottom part of the long part of that tab is even with the base, basically. So there is our base to our pop-up, and at this point you can decorate it with whatever die cuts you want. I'm going to decorate them with die cuts from the large die of the month, from this Monster Love Pop die, because I just really love those monsters. I think they're absolutely adorable, but you can decorate them with other things if you want. You just need to make sure that those die cuts will fit in there once that piece is not popped up or flattened. Now in this die set, there are those decorative squares to go around the outside edge. They at first glance look like they're the same size, but there's two that are a little bit larger and one that's a little bit narrower. That narrower one is for the center. The two larger ones go on the other side of it. I die cut each one of them twice so that I had those squares to go all the way around. And I die cut them out of the Pesto cardstock, and I'm using the Kiwi cardstock for that base. But you can use whatever color cardstock you want. You could even just use white. I just thought the green would be cute. For decorating this piece here, I'm using one of the monsters from the Monster Love Pop die set. I have all the pieces die cut. They're really easy to assemble together. It's fairly intuitive to know where each one of those pieces goes. And I love the fact that because these are little monsters, you can do them in whatever colors you want. I think they'd be really fun doing them with some glossy cardstock with alcohol inks on them to have some really nice bright colors, but just regular cardstock is great as well. And as with all sets like this, they're perfect for using up and die cutting cardstock scraps. And just like the florals from my last card, I didn't do any ink blending around these pieces for this one, but you could easily do that. I'll do a little bit of ink blending for the next one just to show the difference and the added or the dimension that it adds. So once I have all of these pieces together, because I have my base already done, ready to go, I can start gluing those pieces onto that base. The last, or one of the last steps for this guy is to take a scrap of black cardstock to put behind the little pupils of his eyes, and then I glue the horns on after that. I don't want those pink from the horns to get behind the openings behind his eyes, so I glue the black ones down, or black cardstock scraps down first, then the horns down. Now, at this point, I decided I wanted a little bit of extra texture on my little monster guy, so I took some glossy accents, and I like to cover the eyes. Whenever I have creatures like this, I like to put glossy accents on the eyes just to give them that shiny, glossy dimension. You do have to wait for this to completely dry before moving on. If it's not dry, or if you put it on the base while it's wet and it's standing up vertical, it will start to run. That when you first put it down, it's runny enough that it does start to run. So I wait for that to completely dry, and now we're ready to assemble these pieces or add these pieces to the base here. So I die cut the big heart from this die set out of Azalea cardstock. Then I am putting that on the back, the farthest back tab. On the middle tab, I'm putting my little monster guy. I started gluing it down, and then I got impatient waiting to hold, or I didn't want to hold it. So I put one of my little clips on there to hold it down. I only have one there, but it's enough to hold it in place. Took my finger just to press the other leg down to make sure that it had some good contact. And then there's a little Be Mine sentiment from the set. I have that die cut out of that same Azalea cardstock. And then I just have some gold matte cardstock behind it that is making those letters pop a little bit more. So here we have our little monsters, and you can just press down slightly and it flattens nicely. Now this would be fun to add inside a card. However, because of the thickness of the different levels of cardstock or layers of cardstock, it doesn't flatten super flat, but it would be a fun thing to add into a card. Now we're going to do this base again. For this base, I have it sped up so that or to shorten the length of the video, but it's exactly the same as the last one. So I'm taking all of my pieces, I am folding them back and forth just to make sure that all of those score lines have some good movement to it. I did take the base part, I cut it out of Azalea cardstock, and I did a little bit of ink blending with that Concord & 9th Wildberry ink pad. I didn't include that part in the video because I messed up filming it and half of it was off screen anyways. So now we are going to take that tab, fold it down. Then we're going to take the little strips, put some glue on the side of the strip that doesn't have a tab, place it in the center of that tab just below that score line, and then put the acrylic block on there to hold it down. Repeat that same thing on the second one. Now we can put a little bit of glue on the tab on that part of the strip, fold the base part up to cover that tab. Now when I do this base, I actually mess up one of the steps. There's an easy way to fix it, and I keep that all in here, but just know that I went a little bit out of order from this one than the last one. The last one was correct. This one, I missed a step. So now I'm putting a little bit of glue on that bottom tab and putting it on the pink base. Doing that same thing for the second one. And at this point, I was supposed to flip this over and glue that second tab down, but I got a little bit ahead of myself and started to glue down those two rectangles. So the funny thing is as I'm gluing those rectangles down, I'm like, I don't remember there's being a little bit of white popping up in the center. But again, I'm able to fix it. So I want you to see that you can fix it if you do the same thing as I do. There's a way to, or it's easily fixed. Next, we're going to glue those 2 tabs at the ends of those base strips. And this time I'm really relying on those sewing clips just to hold those pieces down so that I don't have to hold everything. And it does speed this base up. This is where I realized that I had forgotten to glue those tabs down. And again, very easy fix. So all we're going to do is put a little bit of glue on those tabs, fold them over and just press it for a few seconds, and then do the exact same thing on the opposite side. So if you happen to make the same mistake that I just made there, it's not a loss. You don't have to start from the beginning. It's very easy to fix it. So now we did that same thing on the second one there, and we have our base done. Now, sometimes when I'm moving this base to make sure it's got some good movement, those tabs that we created at the beginning want to stick the wrong way. In order to make them stick the right way, I just use my bone or my die pick and just push it in, pressing that tab where it's supposed to go. Now we have those inside tabs for our die cuts to glue down or glue onto. I'm just putting a little bit of glue on that little bottom tab, and I'm using the word tab a lot here. For some of those pieces, I don't know what else to call them, but I'm hoping you're understanding exactly what I'm saying. We're going to glue those 3 down, and now we have our base ready to go, ready to add the extra elements to. Now in the clear stamp set, there are some tiny stamps that work perfectly on these little square pieces that go around the outside of the base. So I'm going to put one on the narrower square that goes in the center of the base. I'm stamping it with some Versamark ink, and then I'm embossing it with some white embossing powder. Now, if you have the forethought to do this, it's much easier to use a larger piece of cardstock, do your stamping and embossing, and then die cut it afterwards. At that point, I hadn't decided what color I wanted to emboss it with. So it is possible to do it this way. You just need to use an acrylic block so that you can get everything nice and centered. And then I like to use some reverse tweezers to hold that while I'm doing that embossing. Because that piece is so tiny, you'd likely burn your fingers if you were holding it while you're doing the embossing. With that in the center, I can glue down those other pieces to go around the outside. So my base part here is die cut out of Azalea cardstock, and these center pieces, or these pieces that I'm gluing around the outside, are die cut out of Plum dark cardstock. And I love those 2 colors together. I think they're really, really pretty together. And once again, I'm just using that Barely Art glue. I'm using it to glue everything in this video. I use it all the time. It comes in so handy, and like I said before, it dries really quite clear. So I glued down that heart and then realized that I didn't have the rest of my little monster for this one die cut or assembled. So off screen, while I was waiting for the glossy accents from my last one to dry, I put the eyes behind this one and put the glossy accents on there so that those could both be drying at the same time. There's no point in waiting for a second one to dry if I knew I was already going to do that. So with that dry, ready to go, we're ready to assemble the rest of the monster, and you can see how it goes together so quickly. And I could see this being die cut out of so many different colors. I think you could have a ton of fun with it. And these ones are being used for Valentine's themed cards and in the color scheme that I'm using for the rest of this video. But again, so many different colors would be perfect, and I think it would even be cute for like kids' birthday cards. The last thing I decided to do on here, and I hadn't thought about it when I had my glossy accents drying, I should have and had both of them drying together, is I just used a little bit of stickles just around the outside of the monster on the hair, just to give it a little bit more sparkle and texture. So I do have to wait for that to dry before touching it. So I am going to put it on the base using those clips to hold it in place and just making sure that I didn't get my fingers in that wet stickles. And then you can just wait for it to totally dry. You don't want to collapse it until those stickles are totally dry. So for my last card here, I'm using both of those monsters. I die cut them out of slightly different colors. I have some glossy accents that I'm putting in the eyes, again, for that gloss and shine on those eyes. Now for this one, the pink monster is die cut out of velvet cardstock just for a little bit of extra texture. I'm also putting a little bit of stickles on her horns. Now I would have loved to do the green one out of the velvet cardstock as well, but I didn't have any green that was the right shade. Any of the green that I had was like a forest green, and it wasn't going to go with the rest of the color scheme. So I chose not to do that. I assembled the sentiment from this set, and then I'm going to use the stencils of the month for the heart as well as the background of this card. Now, when I had this card envisioned in my mind, I had planned for it to be a horizontal card, but then when I grabbed those stencils out, I realized that that wasn't going to work because the stencil was directional and it was made for a vertical card. So I opted to change it. So I'm going to use that same stencil set, and I am going to center it on my white piece here. This white piece is die cut, or it's trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm trying to get the stenciled background to be fairly light though. I don't want it to be too busy for the die cuts in front. So I'm starting off with that Spun Sugar Distress ink, being really light-handed with it, using some Spellbinders ink blending brushes. These ones are the best brushes for getting a really light stenciling or really light ink blending, or being able to have a lot of control with it. Because they're so big, I just find that I'm able to get a lighter blend than when I'm using my smaller ink blending brushes. So the next layer looks very similar to that first layer, but the triangles, or sorry, rectangle diamonds are a little bit offset. They go between the other ones. I am still using that same Spun Sugar Distress ink though. Once again, I want it to be fairly light. For this one though, I'm trying to be just slightly darker than my first layer so that there's a little bit of difference between those diamonds, but still not being heavy-handed with it. So once I have this done, this stencil set has 4 different layers to it. The 5th stencil in this set is the all over hearts piece, and that one I'm going to do on the heart die cut. For this layer here, I'm using the Kiwi Hero Arts pad. This is just going to add those little accents in between some of those diamonds there. And then there's the next layer that has some hearts to it, and those will go in between these little X's here. So I am trying to be inconsistent with my ink blending for this color. I want some areas that have a little bit darker green, some that are a little bit lighter green, just for a little bit of visual interest. You could be even-handed with the whole thing. Part of the reason why I did it though is because when I first went in, I just went in a little bit darker than I really wanted to, and rather than redoing it, I just went with it and chose to do some inconsistent areas where some were dark and some were light. For the next layer here, I'm using that heart stencil, and I'm going in with some Lisa Horton gold metallic ink. This is just such a beautiful gold, and I think it's going to tie in beautifully with the gold accents that I have in a bunch of the different cards. And I thought it would just be beautiful to have those hearts in that gold rather than, say, a traditional pink. So once this is done, I did use my microfiber cloth to clean off my stencil. I'm going to offset this stencil, and because this is only really made to do this background once, or to do the whole background, it's not going to cover the bottom area of this background, so I am going to have to move it. But I'm going in with this layer, and I'm using Nebula Stickles Glitter Gel. I regularly use Moon Dust Stickles Glitter Gel, and I absolutely love it. Because I love it so much, I chose this one. I got some new stuff, and I chose this one here because it has some really pretty gold stars in it. So I am trying to make sure to have a few gold stars in my background here. When I do this next layer, I am holding that top of the stencil up so it doesn't go into my wet gel paste. Another option would have been to wait for this to completely dry and then do the next layer, but I got impatient. I didn't want to wait, and I didn't want to have to wait for this to dry twice. It was easy enough to hold that stencil up, to line it up, and make sure that I didn't ruin a layer. So with this completely done, I can set it off to the side. If this was the only thing that I was waiting to dry, I would have left it on my mat, but I wanted to put some of the glitter gel on these little hearts here as well. First, I want to use that gold ink pad and do some ink blending on there, and then I'm going to clean that completely off and use that same Nebula Stickles Glitter Gel. Now, I am going to get some of this glitter gel on my sticky mat here, so I'm going to go wash that off right away. You don't want to let this dry. It's much harder to get it off if you let it completely dry, and much easier to clean it while it's wet. Now that Stickles glitter gel would look pretty just on the cardstock by itself, but with that gold underneath, it really takes it to the next level, and it just changes the color just slightly. Once my background is completely dry, I want to use that same Spun Sugar pad and just do a little bit of light ink blending around the outside edges. I thought it would be just a nice way to frame it a little bit and just add a little bit of variety to it. This is a step that you could miss if you wanted, but I just thought it really finished it off and made it look nice. And once I'm done the ink blending around this piece, I'm also going to do a little bit of ink blending around that Plum cardstock heart. But for that one, I'm going to use that gold ink pad to do that ink blending. Because this is such a dark color, if I use any dye-based ink pad, you're really probably not going to see much of it. So I'm just doing just a light kiss of that color around the outside edge. I don't want to overwhelm. I'm trying to be light-handed. Same with any ink blending. You can always add more ink if you want a little bit more, but you can't take it away. So I'm just going around the outside edge, trying to frame that heart just a little bit better. And it also coordinates beautifully with the gold ink and the Nebula Stickles glitter gel that is down there. So with all of those pieces done and ready to go, we're ready to assemble our card. So I have a mat here that is cut from the Azalea cardstock that is 4 inches by 5 1/4. This stencil piece that we created is 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And you can see that Azalea color really frames it beautifully. And it's also going to coordinate with the different pieces from our die cuts. So on the inside of the card, I'm choosing one of these stamps from the Clear Stamp of the Month. And this one, it says something about monsters and crazy about you, or Monster Crush or whatever. I can't remember what it said. I was totally going to remember what it said, but I can't off the top of my head. But it goes really well with the sentiment that I'm going to put on the front of the card that is in the large die of the month, as well as those 2 little monsters. And I love the fact that the Clear Stamp not only has sentiments that work perfectly with those monsters, but they've got some general sentiments as well, so you can pick and choose. So I use my Misty stamping tool to stamp that with that Wildberry Concord and Ninth ink. Then I'm going to put my pieces together on the front of the card. So I have my heart here that I'm gluing down, and because we're gluing on top of that Stickles glitter gel, we want to make sure to be very generous with that glue. I do glue down my sentiment here and then realize that it's just way too light for the different pieces that I have here. So fortunately that glue hasn't set enough, so I'm able to pick it off. I have it sitting to my side waiting for the rest of that glue to completely dry so that I can trim that down. But while I'm waiting for that to dry, I can glue my monsters together, and I have them together kind of like they're holding hands. Once my glue has dried, I can take my trimmer and I can trim it. Now I am going to take advantage of that white cardstock that's behind it, so I am trimming it so there's just a little bit of a white mat all the way around the outside edges. When I do trimming like this, I line up the edge of the cardstock with the guard on the trimmer, because that guard is just slightly in from the blade, and that way I can get an edge all the way around. Sometimes it's very even, sometimes it's not as even. You could also, if you wanted to just trim it right back, you could use your scissors and just trim it back. I went in while I was waiting for that glue to completely dry. I took some Plum cardstock and die cut that piece out of the Plum cardstock, and you can see it just fits in so much better and it pops off a little bit better. So there is our finished card. We've got tons of texture between the gold metallic ink, the Nebula Stickles glitter gel, as well as the velvet cardstock of the pink little monster. Again, I wish I had some in that little apple lime green color, because I think it would have been adorable if both of them were in that velvet cardstock. Then we have our pink I Love You monster pop up. And I think she is absolutely adorable with all those stickles on there and the ink blending. I think it adds a little bit of visual dimension to it. And then our little green monster. Now I did 2 of these because I wanted to use each one of the monsters, and I wanted to show the difference between having one with ink blending and having one without. Neither one is really right or wrong, it's just personal preference. But I think this is just absolutely adorable and such a fun way to give a little Valentine or some little pop-up thing. And the third thing that I have done off screen that's going to be my next video is coming up. I'll show you that so you can see what else you can use on that base. Then we have our Hello card with those beautiful dimensional florals, and I love all the variety of florals in that die set. There's so many different ways that you can use them as well. And finally, our Glimmer of the Month, and those florals are gorgeous as well. Here I did a Valentine card with it, but again, you could use as a wedding card, an anniversary card, a birthday card. It has so much different variety that you can use with it. And here is the alternative way to use that Monster Love Pop die set. I have my next video that coming up will share with you exactly how to do this snow globe. It's using the mantle village and the mantle decorations as well as the whimsical bottle brush trees. And I can't wait to share that with you as well. So it's fun to be able to take our dies and use them in different ways, other ways than we maybe expect them to be used. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.